other senses, like the light of consciousness.
Good evening.
Light of reason,
This is Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on an oil painting now titled Alone.
Or the light of God.
Alright.
It seems to me that if these two kinds of...
So what I'm seeing here is this is a shoulder and an arm. And this is the head, which is also the head of another arm and a hand that are coming in swirling around down into here. So I'm going to work with that with a very slightly tinted turquoise, cerulean blue, just a touch of phthalo green in it, and a little white, some flesh tone, and what else did I mix up? That's it. Okay, so here we go.
So then, if one thinks about ordinary visual perception and thinks, well, how much do we understand about the nature of vision? What is vision? What is seeing, of which light is the medium? Then we find that science doesn't really tell us very much. What it tells us is that light moves from the thing we see, goes through the eye, inverted image on the retina, patterns of electrical and chemical activity in the optic ganglia and nerves and in the cerebral cortex. And then somehow what we're seeing seems to spring up in a totally unexplained way as a subjective image of what we see somewhere inside the brain. And we then falsely imagine, according to the standard theory, that this image inside the brain, subjectively experienced we know not how, is then projected outwards until it appears to be in the place where the thing seen is. So, if I'm looking at you, Terence, the light rays come into my eye, and then I have a subjective image of you, which is actually just my understanding or my subjective awareness of an electrochemical pattern in my optical cortex. That gives me somewhere in the brain a subjective image of you, which I experience subjectively and imagine is where you are, but actually it's inside the brain. That's the standard theory. And it seems to me an extremely peculiar theory of vision, because it has a one-way movement of light into the body. It has things going on inside the brain, and then the visual world we experience is imagined to be located inside the brain, and not around us where it seems to be. So what I've been considering is the idea that when the light comes in, the visual image is a mental image. It's definitely a mental and subjective image. My image of you is interpreted by me, it's a mental construct. But I think this mental construct may not be inside the brain, but right where you are, namely outside me. And this is an idea which is developed with great clarity by Bergson, who gives, in Matter and Memory, who gives the idea, the notion that what we see, our perceptual world, is all around us. And the idea that it's inside the brain corresponds not at all with our actual experience. It's just a theory. It's a theory of remarkable hallucinatory power, because we forget it's a theory quite quickly. Anyway, so if there's an outward projection of images as well as an inward movement of light in the process of vision, then if this outward projection has anything to it, if I'm not just playing with words, producing a different metaphor, there must be something moving out, some influence moving out, as well as the light moving in. And if so, people or things might be affected just by being looked at, if some influence is going out from the eyes as well as an influence coming in. Now at this stage, we recognize that the idea that things go out from the eyes as well as come in is a very old and traditional view of vision. It was present among the pre-Socratics. It's present in an implicit form. Condition of experiments.
Take two, battery swap.
For the purpose of discussion, that it can be established empirically that there is such a thing as the sense of being stared at.
Alright, good. Go.
I mean, that's an empirically investigatable point. Assuming that there is some influence passing out of the eyes, which can be detected empirically in the sense of being stared at, then what kind of influence could this possibly be? What kind of influence could be moving outwards through the eyes as part of the image-forming perceptive process? And in this outward projection, in some sense, projects the image we see, or the image we see is part of this outward flux, or this movement outwards, the opposite direction to the incoming light. Now, there's two possibilities for explaining such an outward movement. One of them is that this outward movement is in a kind of mental field, let's say, which I think of as a morphic field, which is somehow over and above the electromagnetic field and has nothing much to do with it except the fact the electromagnetic field sets up all the normally understood electrochemical changes in the brain, and then somehow an organizing or morphic field organizes and meshes in and relates to that field but is not itself part of it, and then projects out the image. That's one possibility. The other possibility, a more economical one, is that the outward projection process takes place by a reverse movement along the photons of light which are coming in. In other words, that when the photon comes in, it corresponds to an antiparticle moving out, a kind of opposite of a photon moving out. And that these outward moving influences that move along the exact track of the photons are associated with vision, perception, comprehension, subjective experience of an object, that they're, as it were, the grokking, the grok wave, if you like, or the outward moving, somehow this vision is born on the reverse movement of photons. Since physically speaking, from the point of view of a photon, no time elapses as it travels, the connection between the source from which it leaves, the reflection from my skin, and the place where it arrives, namely a rod or a cone cell in your retina, that there's no time taken, and therefore the contact is, from the point of view of the photon, instantaneous between the source and the sink. But an instantaneous connection, if there were a reverse flow of action, could mean that there'd be this kind of instantaneous grokking, as it were, and that the two would be connected together, and one is the subject, the other is the object, as it were, but through this connection together there's this reverse flow between them. And so vision may be very closely related to light. Vision it would be too crude to say that the antiparticle of the photon is the vision, but there may be the missing link here between vision and light may simply be that the photon is in some sense reversible, and that the electromagnetic field is, in some sense, the field of vision as well. So that was one of the lines I've been thinking about, because it has further implications. But so I just wanted to see what you thought about it.
Well, there are a number of questions to be asked here. I noticed you were careful to say that it wasn't that the vision was not simply the antiparticle of the photon, and I imagine this was because you anticipated the objection that if it were simply the antiparticle of the photon, then the phenomenon of light pressure should not exist, and it in fact does exist and is well studied, because the vision would cancel out the impelling force of the forward-moving photon, and so solar sails and things like that would not work.
Or it could be polarized.
No, this is no problem at all. We can allow that the photon is a particle with physical properties in the physical realm, and therefore exerts a physical pressure. Now, if the vision is in some sense to do with the conscious properties, or properties, let's say properties of understanding, that's moving in the opposite direction, taking up a wave in the opposite direction, and the sense of being stared at, for example, would be sensing that wave and thinking.
Right.
As well, there'd be a kind of pressure in that direction of the psychic kind.
Well, I think then a more elegant description of what you're trying to say is not to call the vision a particle which accompanies the photon, but to call this reverse wave phenomenon a quality of the photon itself. As you point out, from the point of view of the photon, the travel time to and from its destination is zero. Likewise, travel time from destination back to origin is zero. So why not simply take a page from superstring theory and visualize the photon as a kind of a particle which is stretched in one dimension and is both co-present at its origin and its destination simultaneously, and thus able to impart information at a distance by that means. You see, if you don't do that, if you say that the vision accompanies the photon but is not an antiphoton, then you've violated a major symmetry in the edifice of physics, because the question can then be asked, well, what about every other particle? Does it have a ghost particle which is not its simple antiparticle, but which partakes of some of its properties, but not others? And I think you unleash a lot of messy speculation at that point. So I'd rather a more complex...
It might not be so messy. It might not be so messy, you see, because the antiparticles of most other particles are antimatter. And antimatter, in some sense, doesn't exist.
Well, in what sense?
Well, first of all, that the universe is not symmetrical. If the universe had mostly its same amount of matter and antimatter, they would self-annihilate and we wouldn't be here. We're only here because there was an enormous change in symmetry between matter and antimatter, so that matter is predominant in our universe. For a start.
In this part?
At least in this part, yes, all right. But then in this part of the universe, you see, there's a tremendous asymmetry between the two. And antimatter has a symmetrical relationship to matter in our mathematical imaginations.
Oh.
But it doesn't in physical reality.
As we know it.
As we know it.
That's true.
So I would have thought that to follow this, if one did want to see, you see, I'm not so wedded to particle theories. Let's say that light moving in one direction, which already has pattern, quality, etc., is associated with vision moving in the other. To put it in the most general terms, we needn't bring in the photons necessarily, but we see still that the thing that moves in the other direction is in some senses its opposite, but in other senses is different, because it doesn't have as physical a reality as the light does. And that's exactly the same is true of the antimatter, which is supposed, by symmetry considerations, to be, at least originally, equal and opposite to matter.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Well, how do you take it?
This discussion is very hypothetical. In fact, this hypothesis go, this is the Big Bang full. Certainly, if it was established that there was no effect could be produced in a person by looking at them from behind and so on, then this discussion is less interesting, although there still remain some serious outstanding questions about fields about differences.
The relation of mind and matter, the nature of vision and light, these still remain questions.
They still remain questions. Nevertheless, it does seem very useful and correct to make this assumption that such effect had been established. But this assumption then puts us at some time in the future, supposing that sometime in the past and so on. In that case, the science that would be using to carry on this discussion would be a different one than we've got now, and that's a further speculation that we're making. For example, if such thing were established, then that would be the first of all the various so-called paranormal phenomena of recent decades in science to be validated and accepted.
Exactly, that's why I think it's so important.
Me too. But probably that means that a lot of paradigms would be shifted, and therefore we would also be seeking explanation of telepathy and other kind of things that have to do with vision at a distance, remote seeing, clairvoyance.
Second sight, as I
Yes, I don't think it would automatically follow if this effect were established that people would think it had anything to do with eyes or light at all. People would say,
mind.
yes, you've established that attention can be felt across space. And this is an establishment of telepathy. It isn't the fact I'm looking at the back of their head, it's that I'm focusing my attention. And you know, it's most effective when you really bore in. Well, output of the optical system is not increasing. Output of the mental act of concentration is what is increasing.
I just wanted to get to the end of this sentence. That, if we agree then in the implication of this hypothesis that science has been stood on its head, as it were, by the discovery of one paranormal things or all of them on fair game, we have to assume that field theory and so on would have expanded considerably so that various proposed mathematical models for the M field and so on would abound. And therefore, when we come to your argument in favor of Model 2 over Model 1 on the grounds of economy, I don't think that would be effective. So therefore, I'm posing this question to think about: why isn't Model 1 actually more interesting, where we would think of the return influence from the receiver to the sender to be carried in possibly a different field for which any model would be fair game. I don't really see the sense of identifying let's say we have an experimental result that in laboratory people can get someone's attention from behind by boring, as Terence says. Would it really be useful to propose the electromagnetic field as in any way an intermediary for that influence? Or would we rather just have another field that would be a conceptual model for the observed phenomenon, including its variation of force with distance and so on, trying to measure the speed of light, as it were, if it were measurable within that field, and see if there was any comparison there.
Yes. Well, I think that this question is actually empirically testable. I'll tell you how. It's just occurred to me that one of the ways I thought of testing for the sense of being stared at is first train people to get sensitive subjects, so people can do it fairly reliably. Then try the effect of distance, staring through binoculars and so forth. Then doing it over closed-circuit TV, different rooms of the same house. Can they tell when they're being looked at through the TV? And if that works, real TV, people when they're seen live on the air by millions of people feel any different from people being with a blank camera at them where nobody's looking at them? Is there any different? Broadcasters say they can tell a big difference when it's live. And maybe it's just imagination, but whatever the reason for it is, that if one could find that this worked over TV, that people in a studio could tell when people thousands of miles away were looking at them, satellite and stuff. If it were going through a reverse circuit, it would then have to go through electrons through the TV screen, back through the wires of the TV set, out through the aerial, then through the electromagnetic field, and then back through other electronic apparatus to sort of vibrations of things inside video cameras. So I think that would be rather the field hypothesis in that case would be more economical. But then one could test out the rate of movement of that field, because if one could insert a time delay into the TV transmission, for example, 2 minutes or something, and then ask the person to say when they felt the thing hit them. I mean, it would be a very crude measure of this, but it could tell one whether it was moving at the speed of light, or at least anything roughly like that, or whether it took much longer or not.
I think the stack of hierarchical hypotheses here is sufficiently thick to call this more or less fiction. And let's take an audience survey. Terence, do you think that it's more or less economical to assume that this kind of influence is carried in a new or more or less fictitious end field invented to model this phenomenon alone, or to try to cram it into the electrical wire?
I think I'd have to go for a new field.
Me too. And furthermore, the idea of identifying this field, well, thinking of this phenomenon as mental, I think here's the bottom line. Since ancient times, we have thought of the mental, physical, and spiritual phenomenon as operating in different planes. And I think that these planes used metaphorically by the ancients and the rishis of India and all the other mystical cultures are more or less what we're calling fields. And so they found it useful to separate these fields. So if we get a physical perception, whatever that word means, I'm not sure if the same as reception. We get, anyway, some photons, and then we get a mental picture, or we get a brain picture, we get a visual cortex picture, and then somehow this is, by resonance, becomes a mental picture in the in the mind and so on, then that has suggested a resonance between these two planes, an object, as it were, in the physical and an object, as it were, in the mental. Now, the electromagnetic field is physical, at least I think of it as physical, although physicists might think of several parallel planes where there are different fields operating, like the strong force and weak force and so on, the gravitational field, but thinking of all of that as collectively as the physical field. And I like, this is prejudice, I like the idea of the separate mental field. I like the idea that you had mentioned before of the mind somehow follows the eye out and extends itself so as to actually engulf the object, so as it were to know it through an intimate touch, that cognition could be a kind of engulfing, like when she eats the food. That this motion then is visualized in the mental plane and therefore belongs to the different field. Now, we're not inquiring as to these actual structure, the true structure of the phenomenal, mental, and spiritual universe. Only what kind of models are useful to us, and economy is not the only consideration. So coming from a deep habit, an old runnel of thought with mental and physical being separate fields, I guess I'm feeling a bias toward that view. On the other hand, if you could show that this telepathy, or whatever it is, the transmission of an influence from one person to another could be modulated electromagnetically by holding a magnet where it would strengthen them, then that would strengthen the idea of the association, the actual proximity of the two separate planes, without even then suggesting to identify them.
Yes, well, I mean, there's a part of me, too, that thinks the separate field idea is more attractive. But I've been leaning over backwards to try and see whether, instead of introducing separate fields, one can come to a new understanding of the electromagnetic field, and that the connection between vision and light may be a very, very close one. And so that even if there is this other field involved which moves out and engulfs it, this other field may be in intimate resonance with the electromagnetic field, as it may be in the brain. I mean, there's no doubt that the changes in the nerves are largely electromagnetic patterns, and there's scope for resonance there. But the light that's coming to our eyes is a complex. The fact I can see you, all that complexity is in the light that's coming to my eyes. And if this thing is resonating with the whole field of vibration, then indeed it will connect me through the light, because the field of vibration is between us and the light, and it comes from you and comes to me. And so anything that resonated with the light that's in between us would indeed directly connect us, as it were, via the light.
Well, I have trouble with this the particle view. I'm more comfortable with the wave metaphor, and since experts assure us that they're more or less equivalent, and let's just think of waves. And here I am looking at these waves on the ocean, and I see that there's a rock out there, and as the waves pass the rock, their shape is changed, and somehow there is a hologram of the rock as being the wave that comes forward and crashes on the beach, and then there's a reflected wave that goes back. And I think that the electromagnetic field, as theoretical physicists or something view it anyway, is something very, very like that. It has a mathematical model, which is a wave equation, the speed of the waves, and you see the ripples going around, and so on. And this does seem a suitable medium for influence to go both ways. But somehow I don't see it as having a rich enough structure to model all of mental processes.
I'm not suggesting all mental I'm only modelling vision on this so far.
Yes, so to see that the visual part of the mental field as part of the end field, mind field, the mind, the visual part is maybe just a very thin slice, which is somehow in very intimate contact and close resonance with the electromagnetic fields. That must be right. But to identify them for our sending influences around between people, I think, is very limiting. But it would be somehow better to carry on the conversation about the model of the phenomenon after seeing the phenomenon and the result of after these experiments with the video and so on.
Well, yes, except that, one doesn't have to wait for empirical results to discuss the possibilities. And the reason why it's not why I think it's a bad strategy to wait for empirical data is that if one thinks through this phenomenon, if one thinks it through, one can derive perhaps other experiments which are simpler and easier to do, and which might even correspond to existing data.
So it's a question of this, is the Terence said, what was it you said about this is your definition of progress, things progress toward a higher level of integration. So the urgent desire of Einstein and other physicists for a unified field theory is an expression.
Alright, so that sets up the general composition.
Progress. And here we have Rupert, I think.
Or the next step of the general composition, I guess, was already set up with a primer, but it was interesting primer, but this is the first participation of vision imposed on the improvisational pattern.
Well, I think surely if we do have the idea of interfacing
I think that makes sense.
If you were trying to take your metaphor of the levels...
So anyway, so you got the head here, it's also this thing's head, it's also this person's head, it's their arm up over whatever this swirling mass of something is. So that's that for the moment. Thank you for watching this Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom at Chitas, New Mexico, working on oil painting alone. Have a good night, Earth.